September 1945. A scorching late summer sun beats down on the canvas tents of a county fair in the American Heartland. Dust hangs heavy in the air, stirred by the boots of farmers and the restless shifting of prize cattle. Inside the women's pavilion, the atmosphere is hushed, smelling of starch, preserved peaches, and dried hay. A row of judges, local dignitaries in high collars and stern-faced matrons, move slowly down a line of handmade garments. They stop before a mannequin draped in a dress that defies the drab reality of wartime rationing. It is an impossible garment, elegant, expertly darted, and possessing a shimmer that belies its humble origins. The judges lean in, fingers hovering just inches from the fabric. They examine the intricate needlework and the way the light catches the weave. It is, by all accounts, a masterpiece of domestic art. They do not yet know that this silk-like fabric was once a stack of discarded flour sacks. They do not know that the hands that stitched these seams spent the morning picking beets under armed guard. And they certainly do not know that the name on the entry card, the name they are about to crown with a blue ribbon, is a fiction. Beneath the festive music of the carousel, a collision between art and the aftermath of global total war is about to ignite. To understand how a German prisoner's needlework could ignite a scandal in the American Midwest, one must first look at the strange, quiet transformation of the United States landscape in 1943. While the roar of the B-17 flying fortresses filled the skies over Europe, a different kind of invasion was taking place across the Atlantic, one of necessity. The American Heartland was facing a catastrophic labor shortage. Millions of young men had been drafted or had volunteered for the front lines, leaving the breadbasket of the world dangerously short-handed. Crops were rotting in the fields of Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. The solution arrived in the form of the Emergency Farm Labor Program, and with it, the massive expansion of the POW camp system on American soil. By the midpoint of the war, the United States was housing nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners. They arrived in waves. First, the elite paratroopers of the Afrika Korps, sun-baked and defiant, followed later by the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht after the collapse of the Gothic Line and the retreat from France. These prisoners were not just soldiers, they were a cross-section of European society. Tailors, engineers, artists and craftsmen. Among the men were also members of the Frauenhilfskräfte, the female auxiliaries who served in communications and logistics roles. As the war ground on and the Reich collapsed, many of these women found themselves swept up in the chaos of the final surrenders, eventually processed and shipped to the United States alongside the male contingents to satisfy the desperate need for labor in the agricultural sectors. The logistics of this invasion were staggering. Over 500 base camps and 1,000 branch camps blossomed across the rural United States. To the average American farmer, the arrival of these prisoners was a source of profound cognitive dissonance. The propaganda posters on the post office walls depicted the enemy as a monstrous, subhuman force, yet the individuals climbing out of the transport trucks were often gaunt, exhausted, and remarkably young. They were guarded by American GIs, many of whom were too old or too injured for overseas service, creating a surreal environment of little Germanys tucked away in the shadows of grain elevators and cornfields. The prisoners were put to work. They harvested sugar beets, picked cotton, and staffed canneries. For their labor, they were paid in scripturally around 80 cents a day, which could be used at the camp canteen to buy luxuries like cigarettes, chocolate, or soda. It was a life of strange, repetitive safety, far from the firestorms of Dresden or the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. However, for a prisoner with a creative soul, the monotony of the camp was its own kind of torture. The fences were not just wire and wood, they were barriers against the human need to create, to be seen, and to possess something of beauty in a world defined by utility and conflict. This was the environment into which the designer of the flour sack dress was cast, a world of dusty fields, barbed wire, and the unexpected kindness of the American home front that was about to be tested. While the camps provided the labour, the American home front provided the canvas. By 1944, the United States was a nation of forced ingenuity. Under the General Ration Order No. 5, almost every facet of daily life was dictated by the requirements of the war machine. Rubber, gasoline, sugar, and meat were strictly controlled, but perhaps nowhere was the pinch felt more keenly by the average family than in the textile industry. Silk had vanished, redirected entirely to the production of parachutes. Nylon followed shortly after. Even cotton and wool were diverted for uniforms, bandages, and tentage. For the American housewife, the make do and mend philosophy was not a suggestion. It was a survival strategy. In this climate of scarcity, a unique American tradition took on a strategic importance: the feed sack. For decades, manufacturers of flour, grain, and animal feed had realized that if they printed their burlap and cotton bags with colourful patterns, farm women would favour their brand. By the 1940s, this was a sophisticated industry. Companies like Percy Kent Bag Company and Bemis Brother Bag Company employed designers to create floral prints, geometric patterns, and even border prints specifically intended to be repurposed into clothing, curtains, and quilts once the contents were emptied. These flour sacks became the unofficial fabric of the rural poor and the wartime home front, a symbol of resilience that turned the refuse of the mill into the Sunday best of the family. Inside the POW camps, this material was ubiquitous. Flour was shipped in bulk to feed the thousands of detainees and their guards. The empty sacks were often discarded or used as rags for cleaning machinery and boots. To a prisoner with a background in tailoring or design, these piles of empty white cotton were not trash. They were an opportunity. The prisoner at the centre of this story saw past the coarse texture and the faded stamps of the milling companies. To her, the fabric represented a rare moment of autonomy. By bleaching the cloth in the sun, soaking it in lye to remove the stubborn ink of the company logos, and meticulously unpicking the seams with smuggled needles, she could reclaim a piece of her former identity. The strategic concern for the camp authorities was maintaining a strict separation between the enemy and the local population. Interactions were supposed to be transactional and monitored. However, the reality of rural life often blurred these lines. American farm women often oversaw the prisoners working in the fields, and a quiet exchange of cultures began to take place. The prisoners saw the local women wearing dresses made from the same sacks they saw in the camp kitchens. It was a shared language of poverty and pragmatism. The prisoner began her work in secret, utilizing the only resources available to her: salvaged thread, natural dyes made from berries and roots found near the fence line, and the discarded sacks of the American war effort. She was not just making a garment, she was constructing a bridge between the confined world of the prisoner and the vibrant, competitive world of the American county fair that lay just beyond the perimeter. This dress was to be her silent testament to a skill that transcended nationality. But to get it seen, she would have to bypass the very laws of war that kept her behind the wire. To truly grasp the weight of this event, one must look past the fabric and into the specific motivations and mechanics that allowed such a moment to occur. In the official records of the camp, this woman was merely a number, a displaced person of an enemy state. Yet, before the war, many of these women were products of a rigorous European vocational system. Whether she was a professional seamstress from a bombed-out district of Berlin, or a daughter of a rural tailor in the Rhineland, She possessed a level of technical mastery that was rare in the prefab, ready-to-wear world of the 1940s. For her, the act of sewing was a reclamation of humanity. Every stitch was a deliberate choice in an environment where every other aspect of her life, when she ate, where she slept, what she wore, was mandated by a foreign military power. This leads to the second angle, the technological ingenuity of scarcity. The flour sack was not a high-quality textile. It was a rough, industrial-grade cotton meant to withstand the weight of 50 pounds of grain. To transform this into a prize-winning gown required a sophisticated understanding of material science. The prisoner had to break the fabric, washing it repeatedly until the fibers softened into a drape that mimicked fine linen. Without a sewing machine, she utilized the couture methods of the old world tiny, invisible hand stitches, French seams to hide raw edges, and meticulous pleating to create volume where the fabric lacked weight. She was essentially performing an act of alchemy, turning the lowest grade of American industrial waste into a high fashion silhouette. This required a breach of military protocol that suggests a profound bond of trust between the captive and the captor, more likely, between the captive and the local civilians. It is historically understood that local farm wives often worked alongside the POWs in the kitchen or the laundry. One of these women, moved by the prisoner's talent, or perhaps seeking to tweak the nose of the rigid camp authorities, agreed to act as the front. She smuggled the finished dress out of the camp, likely hidden beneath her own clothes or in a laundry basket, and filled out the entry form under a pseudonym. This was a dangerous game. Aiding a POW in such a way could be construed as consorting with the enemy, a charge that carried heavy social and legal weight in 1945. This collaboration highlights a secret history of the American home front, the slow, quiet erosion of the enemy narrative through shared labor. While the official government stance was one of strict non-fraternization, the reality in the fields was one of shared sweat and common goals. The dress became a physical manifestation of this bridge. It was no longer a German dress or an American dress. It was a testament to the skill of a woman who, in the eyes of the Fair Board, did not officially exist. The pseudonym on the tag was the final piece of the puzzle, a mask that allowed the art to be judged on its own merits, stripped of the political baggage of the swastika or the Allied star. By late 1945, the American public was exhausted. The war in Europe had ended in May, but the Pacific Theatre had only recently closed, and the transition to a peacetime economy was jarring. Women who had been told to work for victory were now being told to return to domesticity, yet they still faced the lingering effects of rationing. This created a unique competitive environment at the county fair. To these women, sewing was not a hobby. It was a badge of honor and a demonstration of maternal and domestic competence. When they looked at the flour sack dress, they didn't just see a garment, they saw the ultimate victory over scarcity. The dress represented a standard of excellence that every woman in the county had been striving for since the first rations were issued in 1942. This leads to the moral and ethical perspective. The fair judges were the gatekeepers of community values. Their role was to reward good American craftsmanship. When the truth behind the dress eventually leaked out, it created a moral crisis. How could an enemy possess the very virtues, patience, thrift, and beauty that the community prized most? The dress forced a confrontation between the abstract hatred of a nation and the undeniable talent of an individual. It challenged the prevailing wartime belief that the enemy was a monolith of malice. If a German prisoner could create something so undeniably beautiful and American in its spirit of resourcefulness, it called into question the entire social hierarchy of the camp system. The most striking element of this story is not the creation of the dress, but the reaction of the American women when the award was threatened. These were women whose sons, husbands, and brothers had been killed or maimed by the very army the designer represented. Yet, they stood in defiance of the authorities. This reveals a powerful, gendered solidarity that bypassed nationalistic fervour. To the local women, the crime of the designer's nationality was secondary to the sin of denying artistic merit. Their protest was an early, localised form of grassroots justice, a demand that the work be judged separately from the person. This collective action by the townswomen serves as a precursor to the massive social shifts of the post-war era. It showed that the rigid boundaries of wartime could be punctured by something as simple as a needle and thread. The dress had become a symbol of a shared female experience that the male-dominated military and fair boards could not understand. It was no longer just a piece of clothing. It was a focal point for a community's burgeoning desire to move past the hatreds of the previous 4 years. As the tension at the fairgrounds reached its peak, the dress stood at the centre of a battle, not of bullets, but of ballots and beliefs, leading directly to the moment the military authorities decided to step in. The morning of the final awards ceremony, the atmosphere under the main pavilion shifted from festive to electric. Rumours had begun to circulate through the livestock pens and the pie judging booths like a prairie fire. A local clerk, perhaps while filing the official paperwork for the blue ribbon winners, had noticed an inconsistency. The name on the entry card for the best textile construction didn't match any known resident in the county registrar. Suspicion turned to investigation. When the local woman who had smuggled the dress was questioned, the truth spilled out. The masterpiece of the women's pavilion had been fashioned behind the perimeter wire of the nearby POW camp. The reaction from the fair board was immediate and panicked. It was one thing for a German prisoner to work a beet field. It was quite another for her to be celebrated as the pinnacle of local domesticity. The board members, many of whom were veterans of the Great War or had sons currently serving in the Pacific, saw the blue ribbon as a desecration. To them, the dress was contraband, a product of enemy hands that had successfully infiltrated a sacred American institution. By 10 a.m., the board met in a closed-door session with the camp's commanding officer. The directive was clear. The award must be rescinded, the dress removed from display, and the accomplice punished for her role in the deception. As the fair officials moved toward the display case to strip the blue ribbon from the mannequin, they were met with an unexpected barrier. Word had reached the local farm women, the very women who had spent the war years stretching every penny and stitching every scrap. They began to congregate around the textile exhibit. These were women whose hands were calloused from labour and whose hearts were heavy with the names of the fallen. Yet they stood with their arms crossed, blocking the path to the dress. They didn't see a German or an enemy. They saw a fellow woman who had taken the same dusty flour sacks they used and had achieved something miraculous. The tension was no longer between the United States and the Axis. It was between the rigid authorities of the town and the women who anchored its survival. The fairgrounds fell into a strange, localized standoff. On one side stood the fair board and the military police, representing the letter of the law and the official narrative of the war. On the other stood the local wives and mothers, representing the universal sisterhood of the needle. The officials argued that the award was for citizens, but the women countered that the award was for the work. "The dress didn't fire a gun," one woman reportedly shouted during the fray. "The dress didn't sink a ship. It's just a dress, and it's the best one here." The conflict was a microcosm of the entire post-war struggle. The difficulty of reconciliating the humanity of the individual with the crimes of the state. The stalemate reached a fever pitch as the afternoon sun peaked. The fair board, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny, attempted to compromise. They would keep the dress on display, but remove the ribbon and the cash prize. This only further incensed the local women. To them, the removal of the ribbon was an act of intellectual and artistic dishonesty. They began to organize a makeshift picket line around the display, their voices rising above the distant call of the carnival barkers. It was a remarkable sight. American mothers, some wearing gold star pins signifying a child lost in combat, defending the creative output of a woman whose nation had been the cause of their grief. The commanding officer of the POW camp was in a precarious position. If he allowed the prisoner to receive the award, he risked a reprimand from the War Department for lax supervision and coddling prisoners. If he forcibly seized the garment, he risked a public relations disaster in the very community his camp relied upon for supplies and cooperation. The local women held their ground, demanding that the judging remain blind, as it was intended to be. They argued that the spirit of the county fair was rooted in meritocracy. The best corn, the best hog, and the best dress must win, regardless of the hands that tended them. The decisive breakthrough came not from a military decree, but from a quiet, staggering show of solidarity. One by one, the other women who had entered the textile competition, the very women the German prisoner had beaten, stepped forward. They declared that if the flour sack dress was disqualified, they would all withdraw their entries in protest. They refused to accept a prize that was only theirs because the superior work had been discarded. Faced with the prospect of an empty pavilion and a total collapse of the fair's most popular exhibit, the board finally buckled. In a moment that would be whispered about in that county for decades, the blue ribbon remained pinned to the mannequin. The authorities conceded, but with a caveat. The identity of the designer would not be officially recorded in the ledger, and the prize money would be donated to the Red Cross. It was a victory of the people over the bureaucracy. For a few brief days in 1945, the barbed wire had effectively vanished. The dress stood as a silent victor, a testament to the fact that while governments may go to war, the human impulse to recognize excellence is a force that cannot be easily legislated or suppressed. The enemy had won a blue ribbon at an American fair, and in doing so had forced an entire community to look at the face of the prisoner and see a person. The echoes of the fairground protest did not fade with the sunset. As the tents were struck and the dust settled, the flour sack dress was returned to the camp under heavy guard, but the landscape of the community had been irrevocably altered. For the designer, the victory was bittersweet. While she had achieved a level of recognition that few prisoners of war could ever dream of, she remained a captive of a nation that was still processing the horrors of the Holocaust and the brutality of the European theatre. The blue ribbon was not hers to keep. It was a ghost of a triumph, eventually tucked away or confiscated by camp officials who viewed the entire episode as an administrative embarrassment. By late 1945 and early 1946, the repatriation process began in earnest. The grain-elevator gulags of the Midwest began to empty as thousands of German prisoners were loaded onto trains and sent to East Coast ports for the long journey back to a shattered fatherland. The woman who created the masterpiece disappeared into the sea of grey-green uniforms, her identity largely lost to the official military archives, which favoured casualty counts over craft records. However, the psychological impact on the local American community lingered. Reports from the time suggest a marked shift in the tone of the letters to the editor in local newspapers. The vitriol of the early war years was being replaced by a complex, if guarded, empathy. The strategic consequence of this event was a subtle but significant challenge to the United States non-fraternization policy. Army Regulation 210-50 had strictly forbidden any undue familiarity between prisoners and the civilian population, but the flour sack incident proved that such boundaries were porous. The United States government realized that total isolation was impossible in an agrarian economy. The dress became a case study in the human element of the Geneva Convention. While the document protected prisoners from abuse, it could not account for the way human talent could accidentally subvert the hierarchy of war. For the local women, the consequence was a newfound sense of agency. They had proven that their collective voice could overrule both local leaders and military commanders when it came to the preservation of artistic truth. Beyond the local scandal, the flower sack dress became an early, quiet footnote in the evolution of post-war diplomacy and textile history. As the Cold War began to take shape, the story of the prisoner's gown served as an unintentional pilot for the soft power tactics that would later define American foreign policy. It demonstrated that the American home front was not a monolith of hatred, but a complex society capable of recognizing the humanity of its enemies. This localized event prefigured the spirit of the Marshall Plan, the idea that stability in Europe would be achieved not just through food and fuel, but through the restoration of human dignity and the rebuilding of a shared cultural fabric. In the world of American domestic life, the incident marked the beginning of the end for the flour sack era. By 1948, the transition from fabric bags to multi-wall paper sacks was nearly complete. The National Cotton Council and the Textile Bag Manufacturers Association had spent years promoting the reuse of sacks. But as the American economy boomed and luxury fabrics returned to store shelves, the need for making do evaporated. The flour sack dress, once a symbol of survival and defiant art, transitioned into a relic of a specific, desperate moment in time. However, the legacy of the design lived on in the archives of rural history museums and in the oral traditions of the Midwest, where the story of the German dress became a parable about the stubbornness of local women and the universal nature of talent. The strategic shift in military doctrine regarding POWs also reflected the lessons of the American Heartland. The United States military realized that the labor of prisoners was most effective when it wasn't just forced, but engaged. Post-war analyses of the camp systems often cited the high morale of prisoners who were allowed creative outlets such as camp newspapers, orchestras, and craft exhibitions. The dress was a physical manifestation of what happens when a captive is given a scrap of autonomy. It showed that even in the most restricted environments, the human mind will find a way to innovate. As the last of the POW camps were dismantled in 1946, the physical dress itself vanished from the public eye. Some accounts suggest it was kept by the local woman who had sponsored it, tucked away in a cedar chest as a reminder of the time she stood up to the fair board. Others suggest it was eventually lost to the wear and tear of time. Yet the archival record of the protest remains a testament to a moment when the rigid lines of the 20th century's greatest conflict were blurred by a few yards of bleached cotton and a blue ribbon. The event remains a striking example of how a simple object can become a lightning rod for the complexities of war, shifting the perspective of a community from one of fear to one of recognition. The story of the flour sack dress is more than a curious anecdote from the American home front. It is a profound meditation on the limits of total war. Conflict, by its very nature, demands the dehumanization of the other. It requires a world of sharp lines, of wire fences, distinct uniforms, and the binary of friend and foe. Yet, history is rarely so tidy. In the dust of a Midwestern fairground, a few yards of industrial cotton and a blue ribbon managed to do what diplomacy often cannot. They forced a recognition of shared excellence across the divide of a global catastrophe. This event reveals a fundamental truth about the human condition, that the drive to create beauty is as primal as the drive to survive. For the prisoner, the dress was an act of quiet rebellion against the anonymity of captivity. For the local women, defending that dress was an act of moral clarity, a refusal to let the bitterness of war blind them to the merit of a fellow artisan. They understood instinctively that while a nation can be an enemy, talent has no nationality. As we look back at the wreckage of the 1940s, We often focus on the grand movements of armies and the decisions of great men, but the flour sack masterpiece reminds us that history is also written in the smallest of stitches. It suggests that even in our darkest moments, there is a universal language of craft and resilience that can bridge the widest chasms. The dress may have long since faded, but the lesson of the blue ribbon remains. Beauty, when pursued with enough conviction, has the power to dismantle the fences we build between ourselves.